Hey everyone, this is Sarah at USGBCLA. I'm over here with Fernanda, also with USGBCLA. We are very excited to have Alex Setmajer from Brightworks bringing this material over to us and presenting it to our audience. And we're grateful that you're here as well. Before we get started, I just wanted to walk through Zoom in case this is your first time using it. We're just asking that everybody mute themselves as they stay through the webinar meeting. There's also going to be a bar at the very top of your screen. As we switch our screen share options, it'll continue to be a full screen on laptops. You have the option to minimize that if that's easier for you, so that way you can be out of the full screen option. It'll be at the top toolbar. Otherwise, if you scroll down all the way to the bottom of your screen, there's a chat option. If you have any questions or comments during the webinar today, if you don't mind just sending them over to us, or you can private message me directly at the USGBCLA Los Angeles Zoom profile, I suppose, and we can relay those over to Alex at the very end. We'll be doing a short Q&A. So with that said, we're very, very grateful that Alex is going to be presenting about this. Materials are a huge thing, especially this year as we walk into seeing more transparency. I think that being able to present this content is incredibly informative. We're very grateful to her and Brightworks. With that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Alex to get started.
Thanks, Sarah, and hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So this will be part one of two, and we'll focus in on several of the LEED v4 and also speaking about version 4.1 materials credits. Let's see. So just some quick introductions. I work for Brightworks Sustainability. We are a sustainability consulting firm with about 38 staff in 5 offices in Los Angeles, Portland, Berkeley, Nashville, Cleveland, and New York. And we work globally for tech, higher education, government, developers, private owner clients, and with manufacturers. And then I am a project manager and materials specialist, the background in architecture. I've been working in sustainability for quite a while, and my focus is on healthy and sustainable materials, really focusing in now on embodied carbon. I've worked on LEED version 4 projects, living building challenge projects, and doing a lot with portfolios efforts around custom healthy and sustainable materials programs and evaluations, strategy, and embodied carbon reduction. So today we'll go over embodied carbon just a little bit because all of the credits we're talking about relate to this really important topic. We'll dive into these 3 topics, these 3 credits on the screen, and then we'll make sure we have some time to answer questions. Oh, and I did want to say the USGBCLA will be sending a follow-up on how to self-report your LEED CEUs for attending today's session, as well as this recording and some other information. So in case you're new to LEED version 4, LEED version 4 continues to raise the bar. Each version of LEED is upping the ante to try and pull building codes and traditional building practices up to a more environmental standard. And that is something that we have continued to see with LEED version 4 and 4.1. The materials credits specifically have changed significantly from version 3 to version 4. You can see on the left, under version 3, the credits circled in these boxes have been combined into one credit that we'll talk about today, the material sourcing credit, and then the indoor air quality credits have been combined and expanded, and we'll be talking about those into one credit, and we'll be talking about those next time as well. Also added several new credits, one around building life cycle impact reduction, which expands quite a bit on the building reuse and material reuse credits, environmental product disclosures, and material ingredient disclosures. And today we're going to be focusing in on the building life cycle impact reduction credit, the environmental product declaration credit, and the material sourcing credit and what they require. And one thing that's really important is that these credits focus in on reducing the embodied carbon of our buildings. The sourcing credit also does that in a related way, but these two credits are pretty specifically focused in how we can reduce the embodied carbon of our buildings. So to start with that, we know how important it is to start and continue to work towards preventing global warming from happening. This report came out in October 2018 from the IPCC saying that if we hit 1.5 degrees Celsius increase by 2040, we'd see severe global damage. And what Architecture 2030 has translated that into for us is that if we hit globally in all of our efforts, in all industries, peak emissions this year, we'd have a 66% chance of staying below 2 degrees Celsius, which isn't even enough. So it's really urgent that we act now and do as much as we can now to reduce carbon in our projects. And embodied carbon is a really big piece of that. Globally, carbon emissions in buildings make up over, well, almost 40%, according to this study by Architecture 2030, and building materials and construction are the embodied carbon piece, where they're really focusing here in major structural materials like concrete and steel, make up 11%. So this number is actually probably much larger than what is listed here. And we're continuing to build a lot, and we're going to be building a lot more. It's estimated that over the next 32 years, we're going to be building 2 trillion square feet of space around the world, and that is equivalent to roughly an entire New York City every 35 days. So you can imagine the amount of carbon intensity that those buildings might have in their operations, as well as the embodied carbon that comes from the materials that go into those spaces. And this issue is being recognized globally by many organizations, including the World Resources Institute, the UN, and governments around the world. And the UN and World Resources Institute right now is really calling on national and local leaders to implement policies to drive decarbonization and commit money to the marketplace action in this decade, where they're focusing on energy efficiency here and operational emissions, where we start with efficiency and renewables before we get to offsetting, and then where we also start with embodied carbon reduction before we get to offsetting. And there are a number of ways that we can do that. In California, I'm sure many of you are familiar or have heard about the Buy Clean California Act, which applies to most publicly funded projects. And it essentially is setting an embodied carbon maximum for these materials, structural steel, rebar, flat glass, and mineral wool board insulation. It came into place last year. As of this year, if you're working on projects for these organizations, then you'll need to provide EPDs, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, or environmental product declarations for these products. And in the future, you'll have to select products that have a lower embodied carbon maximum than what has been set by these organizations. And the way that we evaluate embodied carbon of products and of buildings is through something called a life cycle assessment. So we're looking throughout the whole life cycle of a product to see, to calculate from raw material extraction, manufacturing, and transportation what those, what that carbon footprint is based on the grid and their processes and distances and equipment. And then estimating through use and maintenance and end of life what those embodied carbon or carbon footprint pieces will be. On the building side, it's very similar, except we're also adding in, we're looking at all the materials within the scope of the assessment that we're doing, which for LEED is structure and enclosure. And we're also adding in this maintenance and reuse piece. So if our building is 60 years, has a 6-year lifespan, are all of the materials that we're calculating for going to last 60 years, or will they also need to be replaced, and including that in our calculation. And it's really important that we act on embodied carbon and that these LEED credits are focused on embodied carbon reduction, because there's a really important time value. You saw that curve where we need to hit peak emissions now. And as a first day of business for a project, your embodied carbon value is set. So unlike in operational carbon, where you can implement measures to over time reduce the operational carbon year-to-year footprint of your space, once you purchase the product and install it in your space, the embodied carbon associated with making that product has been spent and is being contributed to your space. So the goal is to reuse materials, reuse buildings, and purchase products for our buildings that have the lowest embodied carbon possible, so that we start with the lowest amount of that carbon footprint as possible. So these ways that we are calculating the embodied carbon of products through doing a life cycle assessment is not just focused on embodied carbon. It's also looking at the other environmental impacts that the product and manufacturing of that product may have. So also looking at the depletion of ozone layer, acidification of land and water, the eutrophication of water, and the formation of smog, as well as depletion of non-renewable resources. And then this is important and very relevant to our LEED credits, because this information gets put into what's called an EPD, or an Environmental Product Declaration. Now, I just have the cover of 2 EPDs on this screen, but at a glance, they might look very similar, but they're actually quite different. So on the left here, we have what's called an an industry-wide EPD. And we can tell that because right here it says industry-wide, and it says that the body is this industry body for Tile Council of North America, and that the people who've participated in this EPD are these manufacturers. And essentially all of these manufacturers have participated in doing a life cycle assessment for their product, and then their numbers have been averaged to create an industry-wide report. On the right-hand side, what we have what's called a product-specific EPD, and we can tell this because we have the manufacturer name here, Laticrete, and it's for their grout product, and we know it's their cement grout product. Here they have the manufacturer name Laticrete, and it says here Laticrete. And as you go into the second pages, it will tell you exactly which products are covered by this EPD. So this is important to keep in mind. There's also such a thing as a transparency summary, but full EPDs have this information in them as well, where you can go and see the breakdown of the essentially the footprint of all of those different impact categories that I mentioned on the previous slide. There are a number of tools out there to help us lower the embodied carbon of our buildings. On the product side and the procurement side, there's a new tool that many of you may have heard of called EC3, or the Embodied Carbon and Construction Calculator, which helps us compare EPDs in certain specific product types to understand which products may have higher or lower embodied carbon. There's the Carbon Smart Materials palette, which tells us in certain product types, what we can specify. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit of an echo. Thank you. But tells us what we can specify around certain materials in order to lower the embodied carbon of those materials. And then there are a number of EPD databases where we can get the actual EPDs for products that we can use in our projects. And then a whole building LCA, these tools are doing that building side of the life cycle assessment, where they're pulling in information from EPDs and from life cycle inventory databases and telling us what their calculation of the embodied carbon of all the products in our building over the building's life cycle would be. Beyond just using tools, there's a number of strategies that we can use in design to reduce our building's embodied carbon. And you'll see these strategies kind of appear in the different credits as we go through them in a minute. So project need, can we use an existing building or do we need to do a new building? Can we use less material? Can we use fewer finishes? That also relates to just having less material. Can we design the massing so that there's less material, but we're not compromising on our daylight or other goals? You know, can we reduce concrete? Concrete's one of the biggest embodied carbon footprint materials that we know about right now, and it's used in very large quantities. And can we eliminate parking, specifically because of the amount of concrete, especially underground parking garages use? And then on the specification side, can we use a performance-based concrete spec to leverage really great knowledge in the industry around lowering the embodied carbon of concrete? Can we use the Carbon Smart Materials palette, use the EC3 tool, and use product-specific EPDs, which require a manufacturer to do that life cycle assessment, understand their footprint, and then reduce it over time? Okay, so that is embodied carbon in a nutshell. And now we're going to dive into these credits. So starting with MRC1, Building Lifecycle Impact Reduction, it's important to note that B, D, and C projects can only pursue one option to earn points, whereas I, D, and C projects can pursue multiple options to earn points cumulatively. And there are 4 options in B, D, and C and 3 options in I, D, and C, and they are different. So in B, D, and C for option 1, historic reuse, if your building qualifies as a historic building or contributing building in a historic district, you can earn points. It's worth switching to version 4.1 for core and shell, as you can pick up an extra point that way. In I, D, and C, for option 1, the focus is on interiors reuse. So how can you, in a space, reuse some of the partition walls, reuse the doors, keep the windows, and all of these other, you know, keep the ceiling tiles, keep the space by surface area to earn the points. And of course, that both of those go to reducing the amount of new materials needed for your building. That trend continues in option 2 with the renovation of abandoned or blighted buildings, which, along with meeting all of these socioeconomic goals and providing lots of benefits to neighborhoods and cities and infrastructure by eliminating urban blight. This credit is focused on maintaining at least 50% of surface area of the existing building structure, enclosure, and interior. So you have a lot of ways to save points, but you can exclude 25% of the building surface area if it's deteriorated or damaged, which, as you can see from this photo in this example, quite a bit is. And again, a benefit of switching to version 4.1 for core and shell. Option 2 on the I, D, and C side focused on furniture reuse. So if we're going into an existing space, how can we reuse, salvage, or refurbish furniture? Doesn't have to be from the existing space, but how can we prevent having to bring new furniture in for at least 30% of the cost? Option 3 is kind of an either or. So for B, D, and C, all again focused on eliminating the need for new materials. So you can either do path 1 or you can do path 2 and or path 3, but you can't do all 3. And the difference is that path 1 is focused on using salvaged materials from on or off site, whereas path 2 and path 3 require you to use materials that come from the existing building or the site that you're building on already. And this is for version 4.1. In version 4, all the pathways are combined into one, and you can see how the score, the points breakdown varies. So again, looking at how we can use these, valuable old timber, old mass timber. I'm sure as many of you know, there are beams, especially on the West Coast, that are so large from trees that we'll never see again, that we can reuse in our building spaces. Bricks, steel, structural steel, and existing structures like concrete parking garages that could be retrofitted, historic buildings or other structures that can be retrofitted. And this also, I think, applies to the way that we are designing now of how can we keep in mind to design for disassembly of these materials so that future buildings can use them, as well as designing our structures for the ability to be used for different purposes in the future. So like a parking garage, how can we design it so that it could become an office space in the future so that it doesn't need to be demolished and all these materials go to waste. And so that sort of flows into option 3 for IDNC, which is design for flexibility, but really focused on the interior of the space. And this requires that you have an integrated planning process to increase the useful life of the project space and implement at least 3 of the strategies that LEED has defined for you, many of which are making the space reconfigurable, the walls reconfigurable, and the power distribution system to be reconfigurable. And you can see for retail, the points don't change, the requirements haven't really changed between version 4 or 4.1, but for retail you can scoop up an extra point. And then finally, there is option 4 for BD and C. There's not an option 4 for ID and C, and it's focused on whole building life cycle assessment, which is something that has just, I think, exploded in the last couple years with people pursuing these exercises to understand the embodied carbon footprint and life cycle of their building, and also understand which systems have the biggest impacts and where they can make choices that lead to reductions that they can calculate. So if you're pursuing this option, we really recommend that you pursue version 4.1 because there is an opportunity to earn an extra point as well as to earn just 1 point for just completing a whole building LCA of your design building, and then more points based on also doing a baseline building and showing a reduction. In version 4, you have to do the same level as path 3, so doing a whole building LCA of your design building, your baseline building, and showing at least a 10% reduction. But there's no ability to earn just 1 or 2 points. And it's important to note that the scope focuses on foundation, structure, enclosure, and roof materials only. From interior finish to exterior finish. And you saw these logos before. These are the 3 main tools that are out there for completing whole building life cycle assessments. There's One-Click LCA, there's Tally. Both of these have a plugin for Revit. And then they are paid tools. And then there's the Athena Impact Estimator, which is a free tool but has maybe less information available in it than the others might have for selecting your materials. At Brightworks, we use One-Click LCA, and so here's kind of a snapshot of what you may see based on your structural. Based on your structure, you input the materials, the material quantities, you can put in additional information, you can put in the distance it transfers, how it transfers, if it's permanent or if it gets replaced, and if the product is local or not. And then you assign a specific EPD to this, and a carbon value is calculated from that EPD and assigned to your project. And then based on how you make different choices, that value can go up or down. And the results that we get show us that this extraction of raw materials to manufacturing, which is the A1 through A3 part of the life cycle, makes up 89% of the embodied carbon of this building. So it's, again, that huge impact that we can have in design. And from the information that was put into this example, the horizontal structures had the biggest opportunity, I guess you could say, for a reduction, the biggest footprint. And then it can show you when you put in different designs how each color bar here represents a different design. and each grouping is a different impact category from that LCA I showed you, the acidification, smog formation, and so forth. And you can see how from the baseline building in blue to the design building as built, the reductions were made. So the way that we pursue this credit and kind of incorporate it into our project plan for option 4, doing a whole building LCA, is that we want to start as early in the project as possible. As with the other options, if you look in SDs, if you look in concept design, you'll have a good idea on if you qualify or could qualify for achieving those points. And if you decide to go with this route, introducing your team to the intent and design strategies of what embodied carbon is about as early as possible is crucial. I mean, if we can start in concept design, then we can use some tools to set parameters around what the structural materials could be that would help us achieve the best, the lowest embodied carbon for those materials. And then that can also become our baseline from that exercise. And then during the design development, we want to make sure that we're finding a balance between the embodied carbon efforts and the operational carbon. And where this really comes into play is in insulation, because increasing the R value of insulation greatly increases the embodied carbon of that insulation. And depending on the materiality of your insulation, it can have an extremely high embodied carbon footprint. And so if you're not getting that payback on the operational carbon side, then there's a balance to be explored about where you can find kind of the best performance for your operational energy footprint and for reducing your embodied carbon footprint. And then we want to be using these product tools to help us choose products that have the lowest embodied carbon and include that in the spec. Use these tools to make our detailed whole building LCA analysis using ideally actual buyout information, but you can use Revit as well. And then, of course, take our lessons learned and apply to the next project. These tools all give us these outputs that can be put into a report and used as documentation for this credit. For more information about whole building LCA and how to go about it, each of these tools has trainings, like little webinars and guides on their website that you can explore. And then the Embodied Carbon Network through the Carbon Leadership Forum is a fantastic resource and just hub of information for experts talking to experts, and where you can ask questions, where you can find a lot of research. So it's a great group to become a part of. And I believe it's free to sign up for to just join and be part of the mailing list for the Embodied Carbon Network. You can check that out. Okay, so that was the building impact reduction credit. And now we're going to move on to kind of a smaller scope, which is the Environmental Product Declaration credit, or the EPDs credit. So I talked to you a little bit about EPDs already. You'll recall they look like this for the product-specific one, because it says Latacrete here, and the type of grout it is. The industry-wide one is more generic and states a grouping of manufacturers. And for LEED version 4.1, the requirement is that we get 20 what they call product counts from at least 5 different manufacturers. And then for IDNC, core and shell, and warehouses, we get 10 what they call product counts from 3 manufacturers. This is significant from version 4 because the way that products are tallied, or like what these counts are, has changed, and I'll show you that in a second. And for IDNC, the number of products you have to pursue has been halved. It used to be 20 as well, but now it's 10. So this credit is considered to be very achievable, especially under version 4.1, where, so I've shown you an industry-wide EPD. There aren't a ton of internally reviewed only product-specific EPDs out there. Usually you'll find externally reviewed product-specific EPD. So in version 4, what was worth half a point is now worth 1 product, and what was worth 1 product is now worth 1.5 products. So you can see it. You can get to the there are a lot of EPDs available on the market now, and that number is growing. So you can get to that those thresholds with a little foresight and planning and working with your team in a fairly straightforward way. The most crucial thing is to make sure EPDs are valid and that you're counting them correctly. So there's this great flowchart that you can find on the USGBC website in the credit library that helps you determine if you're double counting a product or not. So one that if it's a unique product or not. So for example, paint, different finishes have different functions, so they count as unique products for every finish level you have, sheen level you have. Whereas doorknobs may not count as different products, even if you have like a few different options within a line. So it's always good to have a buffer, and it's always good to double check that they are not expired, that they're for the actual manufacturer and product that you are using, and that the EPD itself conforms to the requirements listed in the LEED credit. So the way that we incorporate this credit into our product or our project process is in DDs, we like to introduce the design team to credit requirements for this credit, and then the 2 credits we'll be talking about in part 2, ingredient disclosures and low emitting materials, and just explain the intent to them, the value to them, and where they can find compliant products, because there are a number of them out there on the market. That are likely already products that they're considering. Then just after 100% DD, once we get that finished schedule, we like to review that so that we can determine what the gap is to reach the 20 product or 10 product threshold. We like to have a buffer, so that's why there's that little asterisk, but that'll be up to you to decide what that buffer should be for your projects. And then one thing that we've learned through our many LEED version 4 projects over the last several years has been how important it is to protect the spec. And what I mean by that is we put in this great effort with our design team to get these compliant products that are checking all of our boxes into the finished schedule, and then they go into a spec that's open to substitutions. If we are unable, which we usually are unable to limit the spec to just the sole source of that one product, then what I like to do is add in a requirement for that product that has an EPD that any substituted product must also have an EPD. And that applies to the ingredient disclosures and low emitting materials as well. And then also, of course, have them submitted. And then we train the GC on how to evaluate EPDs and submittals, how to track and use the LEED calculator, and then get them on board to help us fill that gap to 20. There's a lot of EPDs out there for products outside of the finished schedule, and a great way, a fairly straightforward way for them to help us get to that threshold. Then we collect documentation and submit it. So here's a sample of kind of our 100% finished review. We'll go in, we'll link the products, the EPD, tally it, and see, okay, from our finished schedule, we have 12.5 product counts. We need to get to the 20. GC, these are the resources, these are the product categories where we're most likely to find them. Let's keep an eye out and make sure we hit this number. In Buyout, we have a LEED version 4 materials buyout form that the GC sends to all of the subs who return it with information about these credits and how the products may contribute. And then in the calculator, we need to list the program operator, whether it's industry-wide or product-specific, and then that will help us confirm our tallies. It's important that to note that for version 4 and 4.1, for these materials and resources credits, all backup documentation is required to be submitted. So every single EPD that you're claiming, you need to make sure that if you've named it the EPD file to state the product name, and that you're uploading that in your submission to LEED Online. There is an option too, for the EPD credit, but we're finding that it is, there's just not a lot of products out there that are meeting these requirements or contributing. So, in the future, this will become a credit that is achievable, but right now it would definitely be an added lift, and something that we would track as a maybe until we know for sure. But having reduced the achievement threshold from 50% by cost to 10% by cost is a big change. And so there is potentially a way that we can work to achieve it, but it's not one that we can say we check off as quickly and as easily as with the EPD credit. Or sorry, with the collecting EPDs credit, option 1 of that. All right, and then the last credit of today, before we open it up for questions, is on sourcing of raw materials. This one, if you're familiar with version 3 of LEED, this one will feel the most familiar, but there have been changes. So as a recap, these 4 credits from LEED version 3 have been combined into 1 credit for LEED version 4. And there was an option 1, but even Building Green determined that option 1 wasn't really achievable. But option 2 is, and that's the one that we're familiar with, by collecting 25% by cost of products that have a contributing factor for our buildings. And the contributing factors are these responsible extraction criteria of being a salvaged material, recycled content, FSC wood, bio-based, certified to the SAN level certification, a take-back program, and then legal wood. And in LEED version 4.1, the legal wood allowance has been removed. But just some key considerations for both versions to know is that the structure and enclosure can count for no more than 30% of your value of compliant building products. Furniture must be included for IDNC projects. In your cost calcs for recycled content, you get 100% of the cost credit for post-consumer content and 50% for pre-consumer content. And most significantly, I would say, regional materials has been changed significantly from being its own credit to now being a multiplier with a much smaller radius and more requirements. So to be considered a regional material in LEED version 4 or 4.1, that product and all of its raw materials must have been extracted, manufactured, purchased, and then brought to your project within 100-mile radius of your project site. And then it's worth double the percentage, the value towards your cost calculations. A key thing for version 4.1 and IDC credits is that in version 4, the percentage threshold to earn a point was 25% by cost, whereas BDC was 20% by cost. And in version 4.1, it is 20% by cost for both BDNC and IDNC for 1 point, and then there's an opportunity to earn an extra second point by achieving 40% by cost. But we're seeing that that is really a difficult thing to do. So it would definitely require an additional level of effort. The way that we incorporate this credit into our project process is in design, we want to do some forecasting. We want to estimate how many of these criteria and how much percentage of each we might be expecting from the products that we're using in our space. And if we're even if we're even close to the mark on hitting the the thresholds, because if it's a long way off or the project's definitely not going to be using FSC wood, and we're not seeing enough in the other categories, then we may decide that not to pursue this credit. And then in construction administration, this credit is a significant level of effort because you have to collect documentation for everything. So for all of your recycled material, for all of your FSC, for all of your salvaged, for bio-based, all of those extraction practices need to be documented and collected, and you really don't know the final percentage until Buyout is complete. So keep that in mind, and then once you do achieve your threshold, then combining all that information and submitting it to the GBCI. One important thing to note on recycled content, when there's a range, the range is used for the calculation for LEED must be the lowest value referenced. So 35 to 40, we'd have to use 35. 1 to 3, we'd have to use 1. FSC wood is usually something you have to request, and that invoices are the key documentation. This itself wouldn't be sufficient because you need the chain of custody number. A take-back program, which is valued at 50% of the product cost, is something that we're starting to see with more interior products, where you can get documentation like this that talks about how at the end of the project life, that material can be sent back to the manufacturer, and they will use that material and turn it into a new product, hopefully. And then in Buyout, from all of our subcontractors, we want to be collecting all of this information as well as the costs, so that we can collate that and collect it into our calculator to submit. All right, and that is all of those credits in a nutshell: the Building Impact Reduction Credit, the EPD credit, the sourcing credit, all of which are focused in some way to helping us reduce the embodied carbon of the materials in our building. Any questions?
Alex, that was absolutely amazing. I am kind of in awe of all the things that I just learned in 45 minutes. So thank you so much for that.
Absolutely.
I am waiting to see if there are any questions. If anybody does have any questions, if they want to send them to us in the group chat, which if you missed the explanation in the beginning, if you scroll down to the bottom of your screen, you will see a chat button. You can click that and send in a question or comment if you would like further information on anything. As of now, it seems like everybody has a pretty clear view on it, which means you did an amazing job. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
So, okay. Natalie's saying that she thinks that the 30% limit has been removed. It's no longer present in the V4.1 credit language, and the V4 issued an addendum eliminating it. Do you know much about that? The 30% limit?
Oh, I do not.
Well,
that's one credit that I don't specifically usually pursue on my projects, but I know that other people at Brightworks do pursue. So
thank you, Natalie.
Yeah.
Thank you for bringing that up, Natalie. We appreciate it. Waiting for anything else. Anybody else has anything they want to add into it? Tom is asking if you could discuss actual material cost method versus material cost.
Tom, could you expand
Do you
on
want to
that
elaborate?
question?
For recycled content, he said he doesn't have a mic available. He's asking, yeah.
Sure. So For the recycled content, you would get your actual material costs from Buyout, and then based on what's been reported for post-consumer, pre-consumer, then you would take that percentage of the material. Okay, so let me break this down differently. Okay, so say this this ceiling panel here on the page is our product, and it costed $100 for one, and we only bought one. This is a very strange project. When we were doing our cost calculations, for the post-consumer recycled material, which is worth 100%, we would be able to claim $1 towards our total project sourcing calculations. For the pre-consumer, we would be able to claim half of $35. So what is that? That's 17.5. So our total that we would be able to claim as far as our cost that contributes to this credit out of our total project cost would be $18.5.
Amazing. And are there any other questions or comments anybody would like to throw in? Natalie says, great presentation, and thank you. I would like to ditto personally.
Thank you. It's great to have you all participating.
Yeah. So with that said, I guess we can go ahead and wrap it up if, unless you have anything further that you'd want to dive into.
No.
Okay. I'm going to switch over the screen sharing right now and put up a give me 1 second. Well, that's not going to work right now for some reason, but oh, there we go. Okay. With that said, we just really want to take a second to thank our sponsors, especially Brightworks. Alex, it was amazing. Content like this would not be possible for us to bring to our audience without our sponsors and our partners. We would not be who we are without all of them being able to come together like this and put together such amazing things. So we really appreciate you taking the time to walk us through that, Alex. We do have some upcoming events. There is a second part to this webinar. It is on February 27th. It's covering the same material, just kind of going into a little bit more in depth. I believe there's going to be like a second expansion of it. So we're really looking forward to that as well. Through the earlier part of this year, we're going to be doing a lot of trainings and webinars focusing specifically on EC3 and EPDs. We're really looking forward to that, especially since this is such relevant material to the year. Again, thank you, Brightworks. Thank you, Alex, for putting this together. And we really appreciate everybody for joining us today. And there'll be a follow-up email that we'll be sending out within the week that will have a link to this recording, as well as a link to the second webinar. So that way, if you guys just want to sign up at that point in time for it, or you can find it online on the usgbcla.org website. We'll have Alex's contact information available as well. So you will be able to contact her if you do have any other follow-up questions. And with that, I think that is it. So thank you so much to everybody. And thank you, Alex. Great job.
Thank you so much. Yeah, have a great day, everyone. Enjoy your week.
Thank you. Yes, have a great day.
Thank you.